Hello, everyone. And again, today we are going to be discussing the idea of a learning disability and what exactly is the difference between a learning disability and what we consider a physical disability. And where it gets kind of interesting or confusing is that a physical disability can in fact lead to something like a learning disability. Learning disability simply meaning something that causes problems in the classroom, right? However, not all learning disabilities are physical disabilities. So this can be a very tricky subject. I think this question a lot from both parents, students, and other educators that aren't as well versed in special education, which is completely fine. But let's talk today about, let's differentiate, I should say, the idea of a physical disability with a learning disability. So I'm going to start with, I think, the most controversial take, which is the idea that ADHD is technically considered a psychological and physical disability. It is diagnosed by a doctor, an MD. Somebody with ADHD tends to have what's called a 504 automatically because it is a medically diagnosed condition. You treat it with medication, and it is involved it's involved in the classroom, right? People bouncing off the walls or people that are sitting in the back of the classroom and are very, very quiet. That's ADHD for you, right? It's a little bit more complicated to diagnose than that, but it is. Now, where it gets tricky though is ADHD affects many different things, not just learning in the classroom. It affects your energy, the way that your sleep cycle works, the way that your muscles work, the way that your bladder works, the way that your eyesight even works, right? ADHD is shown to affect many different aspects of your entire being as an individual on planet Earth, not just your ability to pay attention. That is one of the symptoms of ADHD, is the inability to pay attention to certain subjects, right? So it's tricky. ADHD though is not necessarily a learning disability. In fact, if you have ADHD and it's diagnosed, but you tend to be doing completely fine in school, you'll be given a 504, which is under, a medical accommodation for the classroom, but it is not actually an IEP, individualized education plan or program, which you need to be struggling in school for. So ADHD does not automatically qualify you for an IEP. You need to show struggle in the education system before ADHD can be considered something that is a learning disability that is affecting you in the classroom. So it is a physical disability. It physically affects you. It cognitively affects you. But that's again diagnosed by a doctor, an MD. Now, when you would get somebody with a PhD or somebody that has, kind of my specialization, a learning specialist, an MS in education with a focus on academic assessment, that's when you get into things like dyscalculia and dyslexia and things like that. And that is when we start getting into the territory of learning disabilities. That is when we start understanding how these abilities affect the classroom. You get quote unquote normal kids who have a lot of trouble reading, right? They don't necessarily see things backwards, right? That's a very uncommon kind of form of dyslexia. But you may get a student who does have a visual form of dyslexia where they focus on one word and the rest of the words go like this around the page, and it gets very, very tricky to read. It's very, very hard to keep track of all of those words, right? You may also get a student who tends to have a language processing disorder. Again, we would classify this under the term of dyslexia, but it would be tricky for them to kind of read because they're so focused on what letter makes what sound and what does what and where goes where, that letters start flipping around when they're writing because they're so focused on which letter goes where. It's actually a distraction. That's when we start seeing the letter flips when you're past second grade. We start kind of looking into assessing for dyslexia because we know that if you're flipping letters past the age of second grade, you could be diagnosed with a language processing disorder that's causing you to do something like that. Again, there is a large difference there. We also can kind of look at individuals that are hard of hearing, also known as deaf, right? And I'm not one to do too much sign language on my channel because I am fluent in sign language, but I am not CODA nor am I deaf. So ASL is not necessarily my position as a teacher. However, somebody deaf, if their deafness or hard of hearing does cause them to struggle significantly in school, they could have an IEP. But if it's not causing any significant struggle when it comes to grades and they simply need something like preferential seating or subtitles in all of the videos that they watch, they would be given a 504 accommodation because deafness is a medical disability and it is not a learning disability. So there's a huge difference there when it comes to learning disabilities and medical disabilities. Now, medical disabilities certainly can affect the classroom. If you have a genetic condition or MS or ADHD, or if you are deaf, or if you have another kind of physical characteristic that has caused an issue. For example, we see, this happen in people that are diagnosed with, I don't want to say brain issues, right? But seizures are a big one, right? If you have seizures, that can cause multiple issues in the classroom, including things like developmental delays, auditory processing issues, cognitive issues, socially delayed development, and all of that is completely fine, by the way. This is nothing against people with epilepsy, right? But epilepsy can certainly give you a 504 because it is a medical condition, but epilepsy can also lead to to learning disabilities or learning problems in the classroom, and that is completely fine. Now, I really have to underline this point. It's super important to remember this. Having a disability does not make you bad. It does not make you worse. It doesn't make you a bad person. None of that. None of that is true. Having ADHD doesn't mean that you are less smart. Having dyslexia doesn't mean that you can't be a doctor. A disability is just a disability, an inability to do a specific task or a difficulty in a certain area, right? Whether that be Tourette's, epilepsy, overactive bladder, I don't care, whatever it is, right? Is that you may have a specific issue with a specific thing or a holistic issue with multiple things, and that's okay. But you do not become your diagnosis. It can be an extremely large part of you, right? I have ADHD, I have OCD, I have a tracking disorder, I have auditory processing disorder. That is a part of me. It's how I interact with the world, but it's not Desmond. It's not Desmond Fambrini. I am not my diagnoses. I can embrace them, I can advocate for them, but they are not who I am as a person. So I think that's always very, very crucial to remember when talking about learning disabilities, learning challenges, and physical disabilities. So that is the session today on the difference between a physical disability and a learning disability, and I hope you stick along.